Why and how did the savage metaphor color American Indian history? Was it a misanthropic delusion of one man or endemic to society? Two sons of South Carolina would shape that metaphor profoundly. In 1824, John C. Calhoun will establish the Bureau of Indian Affairs, thus beginning the first design for the architecture of the Indian Removal Act. To understand the legislation generated by two giants born in South Carolina, Calhoun and Jackson, it is appropriate to attribute their Weltanschauung, or the worldview, as shaped by the history of South Carolina. Their combined legislation was germinated long before their birth. Alan Gallay states in the introduction of Indian slavery in colonial America, although over 700 miles away, the English in South Carolina had destabilized the entire lower Mississippi Valley by setting in motion a trade in Indian slaves. Along the Mississippi River and extending as far west as Texas, south to the Gulf of Mexico, and east into the interior of the Southeast, native peoples turned on one another, sometimes old enemies, but frequently people with whom they had no quarrel, perhaps not even known, and captured them for transportation overland to Charlestown, South Carolina, for export to transatlantic ports. With no settlers or soldiers within 700 miles, the English had exerted formidable influence in the region from which they benefited profitably. The money accrued from Indian slaves taken in the Old Southwest, as well as from thousands of victims in Florida, the Carolinas, and elsewhere, was used to capitalize what became a hugely successful plantation regime in the mainland English colonies. The antecedent for both Calhoun and Jackson was born in the western frontier of South Carolina, where Calhoun's grandmother and Jackson's brother's mother would lose their lives to tribal retaliation. On page 3 in the introduction of The Indian Slave Trade by Alan Gallay, he states, Thomas Jefferson once wrote that slavery turned the children of slaveholders into petty tyrants, but in South Carolina the culture of self-aggrandizement preceded and then was reinforced by slaveholding. From first settlement, South Carolina elites ruthlessly pursued the exploitation of fellow humans in ways that differed from other mainland colonies, and they created a narcissistic culture that reacted passionately and violently to attempts to limit their individual sovereignty over their perceived social inferiors. During the Crusades, the concept of the just sword was given as authority to take prisoners of war as slaves. This concept meant any refusal in the New World of natives to not comply would justify Spanish tyranny. Slavery was introduced by Columbus. Articles from the Indian country today discuss his treatment of natives. The selling of little girls was the subject of at least one letter he wrote. The conquistadors that follow will not deviate far from his course. The Spanish conquistadors learned how to subjugate the natives in Africa from their Portuguese cousins, and brought those techniques to the New World. The conquistadors would take leaders hostage and demand gold. They also became skilled in finding the enemies of the strongest tribes, making them allies in their own conquest. The pattern of feudal Europe will emerge in the New World, and when the Church demands humane treatment of native converts, new codes of slavery will emerge called encomienda and requirimiento. Large-scale tribal resistance was made even more difficult by the transmission of smallpox and other European contagions. The degraded military response empowers De Soto. De Soto is the able lieutenant of Pizarro. Pizarro will kill Inca King Atahualpa even after receiving a room filled with gold. De Soto's embrace of these tactics is chronicled by his lieutenants after contact with the Mississippian cultures of the Jalagi, the Tagabachi, Coweta, Chata, Alabama, and Chicasha. In an ironic episode, De Soto will kidnap what he describes as the beautiful queen of one of the mound complexes. He will take crates of pearls from one of the mound mortuary houses that she points out, and then discovers later that a Moorish slave helps her escape. Having studied the conquistador pattern, Chief Tuscaloosa, black warrior, will allow himself to be kidnapped. The Spanish thought Tuscaloosa was a giant because he was 2 feet taller than them. Tuscaloosa had gathered a significant army at Mabilla to resist. 2,500 Choctaw will die in 9 hours of fighting, and they will never surrender. The Spanish will have to cut open the dead Choctaws to make unguents from their fat. Gallay on page 34 notes, Published reports by survivors detail the sadism, abuse, rapes, and murders committed by the conquistador and his men on their several thousand-mile quest for precious metals and jewels. The tribal wars from the 1600s on are therefore largely the history of resistance to slavery. That history will shape significantly how they will respond to the new nation. Resistance was often painted as savage. Carolinians, ironically, were largely Scott immigrants who perhaps forgot Wallace. When North Carolina will open the territory of Tennessee, it will become known as the land grab. The conflicts that arise will captivate the attention of President Washington, who will interpret his constitutional requirements for his office as upholding Article 6. Two Tennessee men of distinction will become the dichotomy of the sons of South Carolina, both of them having lost family to Cherokee chief Dragon Canoe. Indentured slavery in New England will shape the Shawnee response to the injustice of their children being kidnapped and forced to apprentice in Ohio. Newell notes on page 33 that Native American servitude was the dominant form of non-white labor. New England armies, courts, and magistrates enslaved more than 1,300 Indian men, women, and children in the 17th century alone. The fact that some Creeks were loyal to Britain and therefore joined Tecumseh is not without precedent. One-third of the armies at Horseshoe Bend for the United States were the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Loyal Creek, tribes who had suffered attack from the British colonies of South Carolina in the past. Chief John Ross was a veteran of the Creek Wars and would go on to serve the Cherokee for a generation, even through the Civil War. Sequoyah was also a veteran of the Creek Wars who would go on to create the Cherokee syllabary and the Talking Leaves. The experience of the War of 1812 will impact Crockett, who witnessed the brutality of his Tennessee comrades, and this will shape his politics. He will go on to oppose the Indian Removal Act in Congress, being the most significant Tennessean to break with Jackson. Sam Houston also opposed removal. He remembered his insult from Calhoun for dressing like his adopted tribe. His Cherokee wife will relocate to Arkansas, and then he will help a Cherokee band and even former Red Stick opponents who were members of the Alabama tribe to establish a reservation in Texas. Remini on page 113 mentions that Jackson's ally General Coffee will go on to create the Cypress Land Company that will speculate heavily in the lands lost by the tribes after the War of 1812, and that his friend Jackson will join the company. William Henry Harrison, the general who defeated Tecumseh, will become a significant proponent of the lost race theory of the Mound Builders. Essentially, the savages killed the original builders and therefore deserved to be killed. In 1775, James Adair will publish The History of the American Indians. He will state on page 378, "Warriors are to protect all, but not to molest or insure the meanest. If they attempted it, they would pay dearly for their folly. The reason they are more earnest than the rest of mankind in maintaining that divine law of equal freedom and justice, I apprehend, is the notion imbibed from their Hebrew ancestors of the divine theocracy and that inexpressible abhorrence of slavery." To explore the lost race theory, we must move backwards again to 1492. Here the Hebrew-Indian amalgamation will take seed. The Spanish Inquisition was formed where Jews converted or were tortured until conversion. Those that converted became known as Sephardic Jews. In the 1600s, Jews were promoting the chosen people idea in America to show that the Messianic age was upon the world, and specifically England. And ultimately, their goal was to be remitted to England after being expelled. The Hebrew diaspora as actually being in America fills in the eschatological theme that will begin gaining momentum among noted New England millenarianists and abolitionists. Essentially, how can Jews, Indians, be taken slave when God freed them so long ago? Ironically, Reverend Sewell was one of the judges during the Salem witch trials. Elias Boudinot, the first president of the Continental Congress, will find this eschatology especially fascinating. Perhaps his interest was propelled by his Presbyterian predestination theology. In 1816, Elias Boudinot will publish A Star in the West, what he calls a humble attempt to discover the long-lost 10 tribes of Israel, preparatory to their return to their beloved city, Jerusalem. Boudinot, who was building on the research of Adair, will begin the speculation that the Indian mounds were in fact built as altars to Jehovah. In 1823, Reverend Ethan Smith will publish View of the Hebrews. On page 82, Dr. Jarvis notes this as an hypothesis, which has been a favorite topic with European writers, and as subject to which it is hoped the Americans may be said to be waking up at last. Manasseh ben Israel, in a work entitled The Hope of Israel, has written to show that the American Indians are the 10 tribes of Israel. How the history of the mound builders got lost. The hostility between the United States and Spain cannot be overstated. South Carolina began in 1702 to hire Creek allies to capture Appalachia. On page 145, after the Spanish established their permanent residence at St. Augustine, the Appalachia, weakened by disease, moved into the mission system. In terms of converting to Christianity, they were a great success story for the mission fathers. And on page 149, the Creek were the immediate beneficiaries of English success against the Spanish and the Appalachia. Thus, because of warfare between England and Spain, much of the mound builder contact by De Soto will be ignored. The Spanish will record contact with Appalachia, Ichizi, whom the English will call the Ochees Creek, Chalagi, or the Cherokee, Coosa, the Talamajazi, which still exists to this day. They call Abika, which is now Arbika in Oklahoma, Abafalaya, or the Long Sky Choctaw, Chickaza, or the Chicasha, the Chickasaws, the Alabama, or the Alabama, Pakaha, the Ogapa. We also know them as the Quapaw. In the late 1600s, the French will make contact with the Nachi. The Choctaw in 1716 will go to war with the English allied Nachi, and the French noted that they still practiced the ceremonial function of the mounds. Adair will note mound activity in his 1740s contact with the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee. In 1780s, founding father Thomas Jefferson will begin the systematic scientific cataloging on his property of what he calls the Indian mounds, noting in his childhood witnessing Indians arriving there to pay their respect and offer up prayers. In 1978, Ballard will note in the Yuchi Green Corn Ceremonial that mounds continue to be built, and during the ceremony, the Hilashaya, or the medicine man, will approach the mound and begin the chants. In 1991, PBS Odyssey will demonstrate how antiquarians attempting to prove the lost race theory use skull volume tests comparing mound builders with modern southeastern tribes. Finding no difference forced them to propose theories giving the mound builders names like Hopewell, Plaquemine, or Woodland cultures instead of naming the southeastern tribes. Hopefully with DNA, haplogroup Q can escape the lost race theory. The mythological need for America to have the mound-building tribes, and all natives, to be the savage, ensured the American myth that progress provided a providential endorsement. This 1872 painting, called American Progress, shows a Caucasian angel holding a telegraph wire, causing darkness to flee before American expansion. The boundary between light and dark places nature, and especially natives, in the dark clouds of ignorance and the shadows of a new nation. In 1823, John Quincy Adams proposes the idea of manifest destiny. As Secretary of State, he interacted frequently with Secretary of War Calhoun. Calhoun, as you remember, created in 1824 the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he began to propose that the Cherokee advancement had in fact caused them to violate their treaty. Grandma's ghost no doubt still roams South Carolina. A year later, and John Quincy Adams and his new Vice President Calhoun begin the conversation again. Within 3 State of the Unions, John Quincy Adams admits that President Washington set a precedent, but then he begins to echo his Vice President. Calhoun had written in 1818, "The time seems to have arrived when our policy towards them should undergo an important change. They neither are, in fact, or ought to be considered as independent nations. Our views of their interests and not their own ought to govern them." South Carolina narcissism had come full circle. Andrew Jackson will win the presidency in 1829, and John C. Calhoun will become his vice president. His first State of the Union is excerpted at the beginning of this video. His second State of the Union will be to justify the Indian Removal Act. With a bit of foreshadowing, in 1823, Sequoyah, the veteran of 1812, will leave his homeland and travel to live among the old settlers in Arkansas under voluntary removal to avoid hostility in his homeland. Stated in 1847, the Mexicans are Indians, aboriginal Indians. The Aborigines of this country have not attempted and cannot attempt to exist independently alongside of us. Providence has so ordained it. The Mexicans are Aboriginal Indians, and they must share the destiny of their race. In 1803, Reverend Thaddeus Harris will say that the works of the mound builders are too elaborate to have been done by savages. In 1811, credit for the mounds will be given to the Vikings. In 1820, Caleb Atwater, an antiquarian, will once again promote the lost race theory. 1823, John Haywood will say that the Cherokees had exterminated the former inhabitants that were white. 1823, Sarah Hale will say that the Phoenician city of Tyre were the founders of the mounds. And finally, in 1829, William Henry Harrison will again promote the lost race theory. The level of racial hatred was summed up in 1830 and stands as a record of animosity when 2 myths combined, and the enslaved became the cursed. And the skins of the Lamanites were dark, according to the mark which was set upon their fathers, which was a curse upon them because of their transgression and their rebellion against their brother. For this people shall be scattered, and shall become a dark, a filthy, and a loathsome people, beyond the description of that which has ever been amongst us, yea, even that which has been amongst the Lamanites, and this because of their unbelief in idolatry. And behold, the Lord hath reserved their blessings, which they might have received in the land, for the Gentiles who shall possess the land. But behold, it shall come to pass that they shall be driven and scattered by the Gentiles. And they were led by their evil nature, that they became wild and ferocious, and a bloodthirsty people, full of idolatry and filthiness, feeding upon beasts of prey, dwelling in tents, and wandering about in the wilderness with a short-skinned girdle about their loins, and their heads shaven, and their skill was with the bow, and in the cimeter, and the axe. And many of them did eat nothing save it was raw meat, and they were continually seeking to destroy us.